The old house breathed around us, its wooden bones settling with the familiar groans of a long and storied life. It was a sound I'd known since I was a child, the comforting rhythm of my grandparents' home that had always symbolized safety, family, and unwavering love. Sunday afternoons were a sacred ritual here, a loud, chaotic symphony of relatives talking and laughing over each other, the joyous clatter of plates from the kitchen, and the rich, savory smell of my grandmother's Sunday roast weaving its way into every corner. I was sitting on the worn Persian rug in the living room, its patterns faded from decades of footsteps and sunlight, helping my little cousin, Lily, build a lopsided tower of colorful wooden blocks. At 7 years old, Lily was a creature of pure, unfiltered observation, her wide, innocent eyes seeming to absorb the world without judgment, missing nothing. She was in a state of deep concentration, her tongue poked out from the corner of her mouth as she carefully, painstakingly placed a yellow block on top of a teetering blue one. The tower wobbled precariously, and we both held our breath, a silent, shared prayer. When it stood firm, she beamed, a gap-toothed smile of pure accomplishment that could melt the sternest heart. It was in that quiet, fragile moment of shared triumph, with the boisterous sounds of our family swirling around us like a protective cocoon, that she spoke. Her voice was a conspiratorial whisper, so soft I almost missed it, as if she were sharing a secret of immense and terrible importance. "I saw him give her money again," she said, her gaze still fixed on the plastic bricks, as if the words themselves were just another block to be placed. I blinked. The ambient noise of the family chatter, my uncle's booming laugh, my aunt's sharp retort, suddenly fading into a dull, distant hum. It felt as if a thick pane of glass had dropped between me and the rest of the room. "Ooh, sweetie, who did you see?" I asked, my own voice sounding strange and far away. "Uncle David," she replied, still not looking at me. She picked up a red block, turning it over in her small fingers. "And the pretty lady, the one with the sad eyes." My heart gave a strange, uncomfortable lurch, a painful thud against my ribs. Uncle David was my father. For months, a shadow had been stealthily growing in our home, a quiet, pervasive tension between my parents that felt like a constant draft from a window left open in winter. My mother, a woman once so defined by her vibrant energy and quick laughter, had become withdrawn, her smiles rare and fleeting. My father, David, the man who had taught me how to ride a bike and checked for monsters under my bed, was often distant, his mind seemingly miles away even when he was sitting right across the dinner table. Just last week, my mother had told a joke, her eyes hopefully on his face, and he hadn't even looked up from his plate. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. I had attributed it all to work stress, to the simple, unavoidable friction of a long marriage. But Lily's words landed like a stone in the calm pond of my denial, sending sharp, cold ripples of doubt through my carefully constructed peace. "What lady, Lily?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice light, casual, terrified of spooking her or making her feel she'd said something wrong. "I don't know her name," she said, shrugging her small shoulders with a child's nonchalance. "She comes to the back gate sometimes by the old oak tree. He gives her an envelope. She always looks like she's about to cry." She paused, then added, "I don't think he's being very nice to her." The image bloomed in my mind, vivid and unwelcome. My father, my kind, steady, reliable father, in a clandestine meeting at the edge of our property. The pretty lady with the sad eyes. An envelope changing hands. It was the stuff of cheap novels, of tawdry daytime television dramas. It couldn't be real. Not in my family, not my father. And yet, Lily's description, so simple, so unadorned with the usual childhood embellishments, rang with the unmistakable, brutal clarity of truth. A cold knot formed in my stomach, tight and painful. I had to know. The sanctuary of my childhood ignorance was gone, shattered by a 7-year-old's whisper, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was about to follow a path I could never turn back from. The wooden block suddenly felt cold and heavy in my hands. The cheerful noise of the party, which moments before had been a comforting blanket, now seemed jarring and hollow. Every laugh felt like a lie. I looked across the room and saw my father, David, standing by the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand, talking to my uncle. He looked exactly as he always did on these Sundays. Relaxed, pleasant, the cornerstone of our family. But now, filtered through the lens of Lily's innocent accusation, I saw things I'd previously ignored. The slight slump in his shoulders, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the hand holding the glass. I needed to move, to do something. The knot in my stomach was twisting tighter, a physical manifestation of the dread coiling around my heart. "I'll be right back, sweetie," I murmured to Lily, getting to my feet on shaky legs. She just nodded, already absorbed in a new architectural project. I slipped out of the living room, my movements feeling stiff and robotic. In the hallway, I leaned against the cool wall, taking a deep breath, trying to silence the frantic pounding in my ears. I felt like a spy in my own life, an intruder in the sacred space of my family's history. My plan, if it could be called that, was vague and desperate. I would watch him. I would wait. Lily had said, "sometimes," which meant it wasn't a guaranteed event, but a frantic, primal instinct told me that today was the day. I positioned myself near the kitchen door, which offered a partial view of the living room and a direct line of sight to the back of the house. I pretended to be looking for a snack, my hands rummaging aimlessly through a cupboard, my entire being focused on my father's every move. It didn't take long. Not 10 minutes later, I saw him subtly check his watch. He said a few quiet words to my mother, a brief kiss on her cheek that looked more like a formality than an act of affection, and then headed towards the back door. "Just getting some fresh air," he announced to anyone who might be listening. Feeling a bit stuffy. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. I gave him a 30-second head start, my heart hammering against my ribs with a force that almost hurt. Then, moving as quietly as I could, I followed. I slipped out the same back door into the cool, late afternoon air. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawn. The familiar scent of cut grass and my grandmother's roses did nothing to soothe my frayed nerves. I crept along the side of the house, using the large, leafy hydrangeas as cover, my sneakers silent on the soft grass. And then I saw them. Just as Lily had described, by the old oak tree at the far end of the property, where a rickety wooden gate led out to a quiet back lane. My father stood with his back to me, but I could see the woman clearly. Isabella. She was beautiful, just as Lily had noted, with dark, flowing hair and a delicate frame, but her beauty was overshadowed by a profound, heart-wrenching sadness that seemed to cling to her like a shroud. Her eyes, even from this distance, were the saddest eyes I had ever seen. Their conversation was low and tense, their bodies angled away from each other. There were no smiles, no gentle touches. This was not a lover's tryst. It was something else entirely, something heavier. I watched as my father reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick white envelope, the envelope, and handed it to her. She took it without a word, her fingers clutching it tightly. She turned to leave, her movements hurried and furtive. As she pushed open the squeaking gate, a single sheet of paper escaped the unsealed envelope, fluttering down to the ground like a wounded bird. She didn't notice. She was already disappearing down the lane, a fleeting figure swallowed by the encroaching twilight. My father lingered for a moment, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. He looked old, broken. He ran a hand through his hair, then turned and walked slowly back toward the house. I remained frozen behind the bushes, my body trembling. I waited until the back door clicked shut before I finally dared to move. My feet felt like lead as I crossed the lawn, drawn to that small, white rectangle lying starkly against the dark grass. With a hand that shook so badly I could barely control it, I bent down and picked it up. The text was stark, official, typed in a cold, impersonal font. My eyes scanned the words, but my brain struggled to comprehend their meaning. Petition for dissolution of marriage. And then, below that, the names. Petitioner, Eleanor Vance. Respondent, David Vance. Eleanor. My mother's name, David. My father's name. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the end of my world, printed in black and white. The world tilted on its axis. The paper in my hand felt both impossibly heavy and utterly insignificant. A flimsy piece of wood pulp that had just detonated my entire life. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words were cold, clinical, a legalistic death sentence for the two-person nation I had always called my family. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air, thick with the scent of evening dew and roses, felt too thin to fill my lungs. The sounds of the party, which had drifted out into the garden, seemed to be coming from another planet. A distant, happier world I was no longer a part of. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The sad, pretty lady, Isabella. The secret envelopes of cash. The divorce papers, initiated not by some mysterious third party, but by my own mother, Eleanor. Nothing made sense. If my parents were getting a divorce, why was my father secretly meeting another woman? And why was he giving her money? My first gut reaction had been the cliché, an affair. But the paper in my hand contradicted that simple, ugly narrative. My mother was the one leaving him. The sadness in Isabella's eyes, the defeated slump of my father's shoulders. This wasn't the thrill of a secret romance. This was the texture of grief, of shared sorrow. My legs finally remembered how to work, and I stumbled back towards the house, moving like a sleepwalker. I folded the single sheet of paper carefully, my fingers clumsy and numb, and tucked it deep into the pocket of my jeans, where it felt like a block of ice against my skin. I couldn't leave it there, a piece of evidence for anyone to find. It was my secret now, my burden. Re-entering the house was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. The warmth and light felt assaultive. I slipped back into the hallway, my heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm. I saw my reflection in the hall mirror and barely recognized the pale, wide-eyed girl staring back at me. I took a moment, forcing my expression into a mask of neutrality, a desperate attempt to appear normal when my world had been fractured beyond recognition. I walked back into the living room. The scene was exactly as I had left it, a perfect tableau of domestic bliss. My father was back by the fireplace, laughing at something my uncle had said. The sound, which had always been a source of comfort, now grated on my nerves, a hollow performance. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the carefully constructed facade of the happy family man. I saw the deep-set weariness in his eyes, the fine lines of strain around his mouth that his laughter couldn't erase. He looked like a man holding his breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then my eyes found my mother. She was on the sofa, talking to my aunt, a small, polite smile on her face. But like my father, her smile was a ghost. It didn't inhabit her eyes. She looked fragile, almost translucent, as if she were slowly fading away. I saw the way she unconsciously twisted the wedding ring on her finger, a habit I'd never noticed before. How had I been so blind? The signs had been there for months, maybe years. The quiet dinners, the conversations that never went beyond household logistics, the invisible wall that had risen between them, brick by silent brick. I hadn't seen it because I hadn't wanted to. Lily's words echoed in my head. I don't think he's being very nice to her. The irony was crushing. In her childlike innocence, she had assumed the woman with the sad eyes was the victim of my father's unkindness, when the truth was so much more tangled. This wasn't a simple story of good and bad, of heroes and villains. It was a messy, heartbreaking knot of adult lives, of promises broken and secrets kept. Who was Isabella? And what was her role in the unraveling of my parents' marriage? She wasn't the cause. The paper in my pocket proved that. Was she a consequence? I felt a sudden fierce wave of anger, at my father for his secrets, at my mother for her silence, at myself for my willful ignorance. The foundation of my life had been revealed as a lie, and the betrayal felt absolute. But beneath the anger, a deeper, colder feeling was taking root, a profound sense of loss. The family I thought I had no longer existed. Maybe it never had. I knew I couldn't confront them here, not like this. It would be a detonation, turning this family gathering into a war zone. No, I had to wait. I had to understand. My new, terrible mission was clear. I had to find out who Isabella was. Her identity felt like the key, the one piece of the puzzle that might make the rest of this nightmare begin to make sense. The drive home from my grandparents' house was suffocating. I sat in the back seat of the car, the divorce paper a burning secret in my pocket. My parents sat in the front, shrouded in a silence so thick and heavy it felt like a physical presence. The radio was off. The familiar landscape of our town, the streets I had known my entire life, looked alien and distorted, as if I were seeing them through warped glass. I watched the back of my parents' heads, my father's hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, my mother's gaze fixed on the passing scenery, though I knew she wasn't really seeing it. They were two islands, separated by an ocean of unspoken words, and I was stranded between them. Sleep offered no escape that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the scene by the oak tree over and over. The flutter of the paper, the defeated slump of my father's shoulders, the profound sadness in Isabella's eyes. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Who was she? The question had become an obsession, a singular point of focus in the chaos of my collapsing world. My investigation began the next morning, fueled by a sleepless night and a desperate need for answers. My first stop was the digital world, the vast, anonymous expanse of the internet. I typed Isabella into a search bar, followed by our town's name. The results were a meaningless flood. Hundreds of profiles on social media, articles about a local restaurant owner, a high school student's sports achievements. It was a digital needle in an infinite haystack. I didn't have her last name. I didn't know where she worked or what she did. All I had was a first name and a face etched into my memory. For days, I was adrift. The secret I carried made me feel like a ghost in my own home. I watched my parents with a new, painful awareness. I saw how they carefully navigated around each other in the kitchen, how their conversations were pared down to the barest essentials. Did you take out the trash? I'll be late tonight. It was a meticulously choreographed dance of avoidance. The tension was unbearable, yet they were committed to the performance, maintaining the illusion of normalcy for my sake, and perhaps for their own. The irony was that their silence was screaming the truth louder than any argument could. I felt a growing sense of hopelessness. The mystery of Isabella felt impenetrable. But then, a new thought began to take shape, sparked by the memory of the document in my pocket: petition for dissolution of marriage. It was a legal document. Legal documents mean lawyers. My mother, Eleanor, was the petitioner. Therefore, my mother had a lawyer. Suddenly, small, previously insignificant details began to click into place. I remembered my mother coming home a few weeks ago with a new, expensive-looking leather briefcase. It had seemed out of character for her. She worked part-time at a local library. Her usual bag was a worn-out canvas tote. At the time, I'd barely registered it. Now, it felt like a clue. My chance came on a Wednesday afternoon. My mother had gone to her weekly book club meeting, a commitment she never missed. My father was still at work. The house was quiet, the silence amplifying the frantic beat of my heart. I had never violated my parents' privacy before. Their bedroom was their sanctuary, a space I respected as sacred. But I was no longer the person I had been last Sunday. I was a daughter desperate to understand why her world was ending. With a deep sense of transgression, I entered their room. I went straight to her closet, where the new briefcase sat on the top shelf. My hands trembled as I took it down and laid it on the bed. I unclasped amid the polished brass latches, my breath held tight in my chest. Inside, it was neatly organized. A laptop, a notebook, a folder of papers. My eyes scanned the folder's contents: utility bills, bank statements, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt and despair, believing I was on another fool's errand. But then I saw it, tucked into a side pocket, a crisp, elegant business card. The embossed lettering was simple, professional: Grant & Associates, Family Law. And below the firm's name, the name I both dreaded and desperately needed to see: Isabella Grant, Junior Partner. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the business card clutched in my hand. Isabella Grant, a lawyer. My mother's divorce lawyer. It was a revelation, a seismic shift in my understanding. Every theory I had, every sordid assumption, evaporated. This wasn't a story of infidelity. This was something far more complex, far more heartbreaking. The secret meetings, the envelopes of cash. It wasn't hush money for a mistress. It was my father, David, secretly paying the legal fees for his own divorce. He was funding his wife's departure from his life. He wasn't the villain I had started to paint him as. In a twisted, tragic way, he was helping my mother leave him. The image of his slumped shoulders by the oak tree returned, no longer a sign of guilt, but of profound, unimaginable sorrow and sacrifice. The knot in my stomach wasn't one of anger anymore. It was one of pure, unadulterated grief. I stayed on the edge of my parents' bed for what felt like hours, the business card a small, sharp-edged anchor in the swirling sea of my emotions. The pieces of the puzzle had clicked into place, but the picture they formed was one of a tragedy far deeper than I had imagined. It was a portrait of quiet desperation, of profound, selfless love, and of heartbreaking sacrifice. My anger had evaporated, scoured away by the brutal truth, leaving behind only a hollow, aching sadness. The villain I had been ready to hate didn't exist. In his place was my father, a man actively, secretly, financing his own heartbreak to grant his wife the freedom she desired. The sound of the front door opening jolted me from my reverie. It was my father, home from work. I quickly put the business card back where I had found it, closed the briefcase, and returned it to the closet shelf, my movements swift and silent. I was no longer a spy, but a guardian of a sorrowful secret. I found him in the living room. The lights were off, and he sat in his usual armchair, a dark silhouette against the pale glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. He wasn't reading or watching television. He was just sitting there, in the dark, the very picture of exhaustion and defeat. The sight broke my heart. All the years of him being my rock, my protector, my hero, and here he was, completely alone in his pain. I had never felt more like his daughter, and more like an adult than I did in that moment. I didn't turn on the light. I walked over and sat on the ottoman at his feet, the same way I used to as a little girl when I'd had a bad dream. He didn't seem startled by my presence, as if he'd been expecting me. We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it felt as loud as a shout in the stillness. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of surrender. "I figured you would sooner or later. You were always too observant for your own good, just like your mother." "Isabella is my mother's lawyer," I stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. He nodded, his head a faint shape in the gloom. "Yes." The question that had been burning inside me finally surfaced, no longer hot with anger but heavy with a need to understand. "Why, Dad? Why are you paying for it, for her to leave you?" He was silent for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with unshed tears. "Your mother. She hasn't been happy for a long time, Emily. I think we both knew it, but we were afraid to say it out loud. We were good at pretending. For you. For the family. We built this life, this beautiful life, and it became a cage for her. She felt trapped." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "She lost her part-time library job a few months ago due to budget cuts. She has no savings of her own. She came to me, terrified, and confessed she wanted to leave but couldn't. She felt powerless. The thought of her staying with me, not out of love, but because she had no other choice. I couldn't bear it. It would have been a lie. The worst kind of lie." The story poured out of him, a torrent of long-held pain. He told me that my mother wanted to move to a small town a few hours away, near her sister, to start over. He told me that Isabella Grant was the daughter of an old college friend, a young lawyer he trusted to be discreet and compassionate. The secret meetings were him giving Isabella the retainer fees, the payments for filing documents, all in cash, so there would be no paper trail that could humiliate my mother. "She has her pride, your mother," he said, a note of deep, aching affection in his voice. "She would never have accepted the money if I'd offered it to her directly. So, we made an arrangement. Isabella would handle everything, and I would cover the costs. It was the last thing I could do for her, to make sure she was safe, to let her go with dignity." Tears were streaming down my face now, silent tears of grief for the end of their love story, but also of a fierce, overwhelming pride for my father. He wasn't a man being left. He was a man letting go with a love so profound it transcended his own pain. He was setting free the woman he still cared for, even if she couldn't love him anymore. "I saw you," I confessed, my voice choked. "That day, by the gate, you looked so broken." He reached out in the darkness and his hand found mine, his grip surprisingly strong. I am. But Emily, sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit that a story has ended, and to love someone enough to help them write a new beginning, even if you're not in it." We sat there for a long time, father and daughter, holding hands in the dark, no longer separated by secrets, but united in a shared, heartbreaking truth. The family I knew was over, but in its place, something new was being born. A deeper understanding of the complexities of love, sacrifice, and the quiet, often painful courage it takes to be truly human.